Before the first probe ever entered Sol's heliopause, the Ashen Dominion had cataloged 11,000 sentient civilizations across 4 spiral arms, and every single one of them had been filed, measured, and understood within a single generation. This was the great pride of the Dominion, not its warships, not its territory, but its certainty. The Ashari, pale-skinned and silver-eyed, had spent 900 cycles engineering emotion out of their own biology, layer by layer, the way a sculptor removes marble until only the intended shape remains. What was left behind was clean, efficient, a civilization of 11 trillion souls that had not raised its voice in argument for 3 centuries because there was nothing left to argue about. Logic, once perfected, does not disagree with itself. Primarch Kel Asher sat at the apex of this perfection the way a keystone sits at the top of an arch, not because he was extraordinary, but because someone had to occupy the position where all the calculations converged. He was old by Ashari standards, his silver skin gone the color of tarnished chrome, and in 400 years of rule he had never once raised his voice because he had never once needed to. Decisions arrived at through pure logic did not require volume. They simply were the way gravity simply was, the way the cold vacuum between stars simply was. It was Kel Asher who first reviewed the long-range spectral data from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable spiral arm, a system so far outside Dominion trade routes that it had taken a listening drone 600 years to relay its findings home. The data was contradictory in a way that made 3 separate analysis councils request re-verification. The species on the third planet, they called themselves human, the drone's passive intercepts revealed, in thousands of competing languages that refused to consolidate into one, showed technological indicators consistent with a civilization perhaps 400 years from achieving basic interstellar flight. That much was unremarkable. Ashari calculation had processed 10,000 such worlds. What was strange, what made the analysts frown in a way Ashari faces were not built to frown, was the emotional bandwidth of the species' broadcast signals. It was enormous. It dwarfed every recorded metric from every other species the Dominion had ever catalogued, by a factor that the Council's most conservative estimate placed at 1100% above baseline. Kel Asher ordered a scouting mission. 17 operatives, the finest the Ashen Academy had ever trained, each one selected not merely for tactical skill, but for a psychological profile so flat, so consistent, so utterly without variance across a decade of testing, that the selection board had joked in the dry, humorless way Ashari officers joked, which was to say almost imperceptibly, that they had assembled 17 copies of the same silence wearing 17 different faces. Each candidate had been screened for what the Academy called the residual affect index, a single number meant to represent how much of the old, discarded emotional architecture still lingered in a given mind like sediment at the bottom of a drained lake. The Dominion average, after 9 centuries of selective breeding, cultural conditioning, and quiet neurological therapy administered from birth, hovered near 0.4 on a scale of 100. The 17 scouts selected for the Sol mission scored, without exception, below 0.1. They were, in the driest and most literal sense available to Ashari science, the closest thing to perfectly empty vessels the Dominion had ever produced, and it was precisely this emptiness that would prove in the end to be their undoing. An empty vessel, after all, is the one thing in the universe most eager to be filled. Their task was simple: descend to the surface, embed themselves among the population using standard biomimetic disguises, observe for 1 Earth year and report on the species' capacity for resistance, should the Dominion decide that the third planet's abundant biosphere and strategic position were worth annexing. It was, by every metric the Primarch could measure, a routine assignment. He signed the order with the same flat certainty with which he signed everything, and he did not think about it again for several months, because there was nothing in the data to suggest he should. He would come to regret that certainty more than anything else in 400 years of governance. He would come to understand, far too late, that he had made a mistake so fundamental it would unmake the empire he had spent his life perfecting, and the mistake was not sending the scouts. The mistake was letting them come home. The 17 scouts trained for 6 years before deployment, in a facility carved into the dark side of the Dominion's third moon, where windows were forbidden because Windows Imp lied a desire to look at things, and desire was a word that had been quietly retired from the Ashari vocabulary generations ago. They studied human languages through cold linguistic algorithms, learning to parse grammar and syntax the way a machine parses code, without ever once being taught, because no instructor could have taught it having never learned it themselves, that a human sentence could carry a second unspoken meaning beneath its literal one. That tone and pause and the particular tremor in a voice could say the opposite of the words being used and somehow still be understood perfectly by every listener in the room. They studied human history as a sequence of conflict statistics, casualty ratios, resource competitions. The Ashari had no framework for understanding history as anything but a ledger of inefficiency, and so their briefing packets on the Renaissance, on Jazage New Orleans, on the slow accumulation of humanity's small, defiant beauties across 10,000 years of famine and war and loss, reduced each era to a table of economic output and mortality figures. Entirely blind to the fact that the very species being tabulated had spent every one of those centuries making things. Songs, stories, temples, quilts, recipes passed hand to hand across generations, for reasons no ledger could ever capture. They practiced human facial expressions in mirrors, the corners of their mouths twitching upward into the shapes called smiles, degrees of curvature measured and adjusted by patient instructors, until each scout could produce a convincing approximation on command, the way an actor learns blocking, never once suspecting that the humans they were meant to imitate smiled for reasons that had nothing to do with command at all. In their final year, as a culminating exercise, all 17 were shown, under strict clinical supervision and for a duration capped at 90 seconds, a single piece of human recorded music, chosen by the Academy specifically for its perceived emotional inertness, a jingle from a decades-old human television advertisement, tinny and forgettable, selected because analysis suggested it carried the lowest measurable emotional payload of any catalogued human audio sample. Every one of the 17 candidates passed the exercise without incident. Not one of them, nor a single instructor overseeing the trial, understood that the true danger had never been the inert. It had been withheld from them entirely. The trumpet, the ocean, the chili, the shoulder that felt like home. The exercise had proven nothing except that a starving species can be shown crumbs indefinitely and remain calm. It says nothing at all about what happens when that same species is finally handed the feast. Not one of the 17 understood, at the moment their ship broke atmosphere above a city called Prague on a gray October morning, that they were about to encounter something their entire species had systematically engineered itself to be unable to survive. Their commanding officer aboard the orbital platform was Fleet Commander Ussa Thren, a woman whose calm was so absolute that junior officers sometimes checked her vital signs out of simple curiosity, wondering if perhaps she had achieved some biological state beyond even Ashari norms. It was Thren who received the first reports, and it was Thren who, 6 weeks into the mission, began to notice that something in the data streams had gone strange. The first scout to go quiet was designated VE-11, a specialist in urban infiltration who had been assigned to New Orleans. His early reports were models of Ashari precision population density figures, infrastructure vulnerability assessments, notes on the human tendency toward tribal social clustering. And then on the 43rd day, his scheduled transmission arrived 4 hours late, and when it did arrive, it did not contain data. It contained 11 minutes of unbroken audio. Fleet Commander Thren played the recording twice before she understood what she was hearing. It was a trumpet. A single human musician standing on a street corner in the evening humidity, playing something the local humans apparently called jazz, and underneath the recording, barely audible, was the sound of VE-11's own breathing, ragged and uneven in a way that had no precedent in 6 years of Academy-monitored biometrics. There was no report attached. There was no analysis. There was only the horn, bending and climbing and falling apart and reassembling itself in patterns that followed no rule VE11 had ever been trained to recognize, and his breath catching every time the melody did something unexpected, which was often because Thren would later learn, once she understood enough of human music theory to grasp it. The entire idiom of jazz was built on the principle of expected structure being deliberately, beautifully broken. VE11 did not send another data report for the remainder of the mission. He sent recordi. NGS dozens of them. A woman singing something called the blues in a smoke-filled room, her voice cracking on notes that by any Ashari vocal efficiency standard she should have simply sung cleanly. And yet the cracking was the point, Thren realized with a slow, cold horror. The imperfection was where all the meaning lived. He sent a recording of church gospel on a Sunday morning, 80 voices rising together in a harmony that had not been written down anywhere, that existed only in the shared, unspoken agreement of everyone in the room to lift a single note a little higher than logic would ever have demanded. And beneath it, the sound of hands clapping off the beat just enough to feel like a heartbeat rather than a metronome. He sent once without any commentary at all, 4 minutes of a brass band parading down a narrow street at dusk, trombones blaring over a crowd that had simply gathered, unbidden, unpaid, uncommanded, to dance in the road because the music had told them to and they had astonishingly obeyed. Thren played that one only once. She found she could not bring herself to play it again, not out of discipline, she would admit much later, but because some small, treacherous part of her had not wanted the feeling it produced to fade, and had decided without her permission to keep it rare and therefore precious. A logic so thoroughly human that she did not recognize it in herself until it was already far too late to root it out. She sent the recordings up the chain to the Dominion's Cultural Analysis Division, and the report that came back 3 weeks later used a phrase that would recur, with increasing frequency and increasing alarm throughout the rest of the mission. Emotional payload exceeding processing tolerance. Scout Delenn Voss went quiet 9 days after VE11. She had been embedded in Tokyo, tasked with assessing East Asian technological infrastructure. Her final coherent transmission described, in increasingly fragmented Ashari technical shorthand, her attempt to understand a human phenomenon called cinema. She had entered a theater to observe crowd behavior, a purely tactical decision, she noted, underlining the word purely twice in a way that Ashari script was never designed to accommodate emphasis for. Because emphasis, like desire, was a concept the language had shed generations ago. The film she watched, Thren later obtained a copy and forced herself to sit through all 141 minutes of it, an experience she described in her own log, uncharacteristically, as difficult, followed a father searching for his lost child across an entire ocean. Delenn Voss's transmission log showed her heart rate had spiked to levels the Academy physicians classified as medically alarming during the film's final 11 minutes, and her final message, sent at 3:47 a.m. local time from a payphone outside the theater rather than through secure channel, consisted of 9 words in broken, desperate Ashari. I did not know we could feel this. She did not report again. 3 weeks later, satellite tracking of her biosignature, before it too went dark, deliberately, the Dominion would later confirm, disabled by her own hand, showed her working as a translator in a small apartment above a ramen shop, learning to eat foods her biology had never been designed to metabolize, learning to cry at films on purpose, for pleasure the way humans apparently did on weekends. Curled on second-hand furniture with takeout containers and blankets, and a species of contentment the Dominion had no data classification for. Fleet Commander Thren convened an emergency council with the 11 scouts who remained in contact, intending to issue a formal directive. Emotional exposure was to be minimized, contact with human cultural artifacts restricted to necessary observation only. The directive was drafted, encoded, and transmitted to all remaining scouts within 72 hours of Delenn Voss's disappearance. It was, in retrospect, the single most catastrophic tactical error of the entire mission, because it required Thren to attach reference examples, actual samples of what the scouts were meant to avoid, so that the directive would be unambiguous. She attached 4 minutes of a Beethoven symphony, 40 seconds of a Van Gogh painting rendered in high-resolution scan, and photographs of a dish called biryani, its steam curling with saffron and cardamom, captured by a scout's optical implant during a supposedly routine surveillance operation of a Mumbai marketplace. Among those 6 was a scout designated Cirrus 9, stationed in Mumbai under the cover identity of a textile logistics consultant, whose defection would later become, within the small surviving circle of Dominion cultural analysts, something close to legend, because it was the only one triggered not by music or image but by a single act of eating. Cirrus 9 had been instructed, as part of routine market infiltration protocol, to purchase pho odd from a street vendor as a means of establishing an unremarkable human cover while observing regional trade patterns. He selected, at random, a paper cone of something the vendor called bel puri, tossed with tamarind and green chili and a chutney the color of a Dominion warning light, and he ate it standing in the crush of the evening market, surrounded by scooter horns and the calls of a dozen other vendors, and the specific, particular heat of a Mumbai evening pressing down like a hand. His own biometric log, recovered later, showed his heart rate spike within 4 seconds of the first bite, a spike his onboard systems initially flagged as an allergic reaction requiring immediate medical intervention. It was not an allergic reaction. It was, his final coherent transmission explained, in a Ashari groan ragged with something that was not quite panic and not quite joy, but sat uncomfortably close to both. The first time in his engineered life that his own body had produced a sensation his mind could not immediately classify, control, or predict. The chili bloomed at the back of his throat and did not stop blooming. Wave after wave of heat that should by every principle of Ashari physiology have registered as damage, as a system fault requiring correction, and instead it built towards something that felt, he wrote dangerously, thrillingly, like being alive for the first time in a life that had, until that exact moment, only ever been lived at the Dominion's approved and carefully governed temperature. He bought a second cone before he had finished the first. He did not file another report. 6 weeks later, satellite imaging located his biosignature working the evening shift at the very same stall, learning to fold newspaper cones with the vendor's own quick, practiced hands tasting, for the sheer unjustifiable pleasure of tasting, every single dish the narrow street had to offer, one paper cone at a time, as though he were trying to make up in a single season. For 900 years of a civilization that had never once let itself be hungry for anything it could not immediately explain. Within 11 days, 6 more scouts had gone dark. It was, the Dominion's cultural division would eventually conclude in a report so carefully worded it took the Primarch 3 readings to fully absorb its implications. Not that human culture was dangerous in the way a weapon was dangerous. It was dangerous in the way that water was dangerous to a species that had evolved entirely without it, and then, through some accident of contact, discovered they could drink. The Ashari had not engineered emotion out of their biology because emotion was inherently destructive. They had done it because emotion was inefficient, unpredictable, difficult to govern at scale. And in doing so over 900 years, they had created 11 trillion beings whose neurological architecture retained every last vestige of the capacity for feeling, wired and waiting and utterly starved, like a muscle atrophied but never removed. Human culture did not introduce something foreign into the Ashari mind. It woke something that had been sleeping, bound, and quietly resentful for 9 centuries. By the 4-month mark, only 3 of the original 17 scouts were still transmitting coherent reports, and Fleet Commander Thren, against every protocol in her considerable career, requested in writing to be relieved of the mission, citing what she described as a compromised capacity for objective assessment. Her own listening logs later recovered showed that in the preceding 2 weeks she had replayed VE 11 trumpet recording 183 times. It was at this point that Primarch Kel Asher, reviewing a mission he had signed off on with barely a second thought, made his second catastrophic decision. He did not abort the mission. He did not order the remaining scouts recalled by force, which, had he done so immediately with overwhelming tactical decisiveness, might have salvaged something of the Dominion's original intent. Instead, driven by the same cold curiosity that had built an empire, he decided the anomaly required a personal, disciplined, unimpeachable investigation. He selected his most trusted officer, a man whose loyalty and self-control were, in the Primarch's own private assessment, beyond question. Admiral Vantric Saul had served the Dominion for 211 years, without a single documented lapse in emotional regulation. He had commanded the pacification of the Asharin uprising with a calm so total that historical records described him standing motionless through an engagement in which 40% of his own fleet was destroyed, issuing orders in a voice that never once changed register. He regarded the 17 scouts, when he was briefed on their fate, with something the Primarch might have called contempt, if contempt were a word the Ashari still used. Weakness, Vantric Saul wrote in his own mise. Sion log before departure is not a virus. It is a failure of discipline, and I do not fail. He took command of a single vessel, the Occlusion, sleek and silent and utterly without ornament, every surface engineered for function and function alone. And he set course for Earth with the absolute confidence of a man who did not yet understand that he was sailing toward the one force in the galaxy his civilization had spent 900 years building itself specifically incapable of resisting. The Occlusion broke orbit above Earth on a clear night in late spring, and Admiral Vantric Saul's first act before even beginning his investigation was to review 6 months of accumulated surveillance data from the scattered remains of his scouting network. The 11 scouts now gone, the 6 still nominally reporting, the vast tangle of recordings, images, and fragmented human media that Fleet Commander Thren's teams had gathered before the whole apparatus of observation began quietly dissolving from the inside. He watched it the way a surgeon watches an X-ray, clinically, at high speed, cataloging rather than experiencing. He told himself this, at least, for the first several hours. The bridge of the Occlusion was a masterpiece of Ashari design, matte gray bulkheads, instrument panels that glowed the exact same shade of cool blue as every other Dominion vessel ever constructed, silence so complete that the ship's own life support hum was the loudest sound aboard. Vantric Saul had spent 2 centuries finding this silence restful. It was, he would later admit in a log entry he never transmitted home, the first time in his career that the silence felt less like peace and more like absence. He began methodically with the recording that had started it all. V11 trumpet. He played it once, made note of its structural properties, the harmonic intervals, the rhythmic variants, the way the human musician had deliberately introduced dissonance and then resolved it. A technique the Dominion's own musical archives, thin and sparse as they were, classified under a single clinical entry: tension release patterning, associated with heightened neural engagement in primitive auditory processing. Vantric Saul found the classification satisfying. It reduced the recording to a mechanism, a trick of biology, nothing more mysterious than a magnet pulling at iron filings. He moved on to the next file. The next file was 11 seconds long. A child's laughter, captured incidentally by a scout surveillance equipment during a public park observation, the sound rising and cascading and utterly unself-conscious in a way that had no equivalent anywhere in the 11,000 catalogued civilizations of Dominion space. Vantric Saul listened to it 4 times before he realized he had stopped taking notes. He corrected himself. He was, after all, a man who did not fail. He returned to protocol, methodical and rigorous, cataloging 3 more incidental recordings: the low murmur of a crowded market at dawn, a child counting in a game whose rules no analyst could reconstruct, the specific silence of a cathedral at midday, thick with dust motes turning slow in colored light, and told himself each one was simply data, another entry in a ledger that would, eventually, add up to a conclusion he could report home with the same flat certainty that had carried him through 2 centuries of unblemished service. For the next several Earth days, he ran his investigation the way he had run every campaign of his long career, descending to the surface in a biomimetic disguise so convincingly human that even close-range biological scanners registered him as an ordinary man in his 50s, gray at the temples, unremarkable in every visible way. He tracked down the last known location of VE-11 first, because VE-11 defection had been the origin point. The index case and Vantric Sol operated on the assumption reasonable by any prior Dominion experience that understanding the first infection would explain all subsequent ones. He found VE-11 on a Tuesday evening, playing bass guitar in a small club in the French Quarter, 3 blocks from the corner where he had first heard the trumpet that unmade him. The club was dim and close and smelled of spilled bourbon and cigarette smoke that clung to the old wood paneling, and the small stage was lit in amber that made every face in the room look warm, worn, alive. Vantric Sol took a table near the back and ordered a drink he had no intention of consuming purely, he told himself, for cover, and watched a man who had once been the Dominion's most decorated infiltration specialist close his eyes and lean into a baseline with an expression on his face that the Admiral's translation software, running quietly in the back of his mind, flagged with a single word: joy. He approached VE-11 during the set break, using a recognition code that only Dominion officers would know, a specific sequence of blink patterns. ND hand positioning that VE-11 eyes registered immediately, his whole body going rigid for just a moment before he set down his beer and walked, without hesitation, to Vantric Sol's table. Admiral, VE-11 said, and his Ashari was rusty, thick with disuse, the vowels bending toward human phonetics in a way that made the Admiral's skin, the real skin beneath the disguise, prickle with something he did not have a word for. I wondered when they'd send someone. You will explain yourself, Vantric Sol said, and even to his own ears the words sounded strange in this room, too clean, too sharp, cut from a different cloth than everything around them. VE-11 looked at him for a long moment, and then he did something no Ashari officer had done in Vantric Sol's presence in 211 years of service. He smiled, not the trained, measured approximation the Academy taught, degrees of curvature calibrated for human mimicry, but something looser, something that reached all the way to the corners of his eyes and stayed there. I don't think I can, he said. I don't think there are words for it in our language. That's the problem, Admiral, that's the whole problem. We built a language with no room in it for what I'm about to try to describe, and every year we kept building it that way. We were cutting a piece out of ourselves and calling it progress. He gestured at the stage, at the drummer counting off the next song, at the small crowd already leaning forward in anticipation. Stay for the second set. I'm not going to try to convince you of anything. I'm just going to play, and you can decide for yourself whether you still believe what the Academy taught you about what we are, and what we're capable of failing. Vantric Sol stayed. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He stayed through the second set and a third, unscheduled and unplanned, that the club owner allowed because, as she told the Admiral in the disguised comfortable warmth of his cover identity, sliding him another drink he still did not touch, the room wanted it, and you don't argue with a room that wants something, honey, you just let it have it. He stayed until 2 a.m., watching VE-11 hands move across the bass strings with an ease that spoke of thousands of hours of practice undertaken for no strategic purpose whatsoever. No mission objective, nothing but the simple, staggering fact that it made him feel something. And that feeling something, once discovered, had turned out to be worth more to him than 2 centuries of loyal Dominion service. Somewhere near the end of the third set, the club owner cut the house lights down to almost nothing, leaving only the stage lamps and the small candles guttering on each table, and a young couple near the front, strangers to each other an hour earlier by the look of it, began to dance in the narrow space between the tables, slow and unhurried, her head tipping onto his shoulder as though it belonged there. As though 6,000 years of human courtship had distilled itself into that one unremarkable gesture and handed it to them for free. Vantric Saul watched them the way he had watched Vey 11 hands on the bass strings, cataloging at first proximity, synchrony, elevated pair bonding indicators. And then, somewhere in the second minute, simply watching the clinical vocabulary falling away from his mind like scaffolding stripped from a finished building. He noted in the draft of his report he would later delete that he had felt something almost like grief at the sight of it, though grief was a word 2 centuries of academy training had never once required him to define for himself. And he did not know, sitting alone at his table with an untouched drink sweating a ring into the old wood, whether the grief belonged to the couple or to the 11 trillion Ashari who had never once been permitted to learn that a stranger's shoulder could feel like home, or to some smaller, quieter version of himself that he was only now, at 211 years old, beginning to suspect he had never actually met. He left before dawn without saying goodbye, and in the report he filed that night, a report he rewrote 4 times before transmission, each draft slightly less clinical than the last, a fact he noted with a distant, cold alarm even as he could not seem to stop it from happening. He wrote a single line that Fleet Commander Thren would later flag in her own private notes as the first sign that the Dominion's most disciplined officer was no longer entirely certain which side of the investigation he stood on. The subject does not appear diminished by his defection. I had expected to find him broken. I did not. He tracked down 2 more of the missing scouts over the following weeks, and each encounter chipped away at something in him that he had believed, until this mission, to be load-bearing. He found Delaine Voss in her small Tokyo apartment above the ramen shop, teaching herself tea. O'Cook, her kitchen counter cluttered with mismatched bowls and a single dog-eared cookbook whose spine had been broken from repeated use. And when he asked her clinically, he told himself, purely for the report, why she had chosen to remain. She set down the knife she had been using to slice scallions with a precision that would have satisfied any academy instructor and said, "Because I get to choose things now, Admiral. Do you understand what that means? On the Dominion, everything I ever did was the correct action, the optimal path, calculated and confirmed before I ever moved. Here, I get to choose the wrong thing sometimes, just because I want to, and nothing happens except that I learn something about myself that no algorithm could have told me." She gestured at the half-finished pot of broth on the stove, its surface trembling gently with heat, filling the small apartment with an aroma of pork bone and ginger, and something faintly sweet that the Admiral's disguised human nose registered as unmistakably comforting. "Try it," she said. "It's not optimal. I burned the first batch, but it's mine." He did not try it. He told himself this was discipline. He was aware, even as he told himself this, that the refusal had cost him something, a small effort of will that should not have been necessary and had been. He stayed longer than the mission required, seated on an upturned crate by her small window while the broth reduced and thickened and filled the apartment with steam that beaded on the cold glass. And he asked her because the report needed it. He told himself what she missed of the Dominion, expecting an answer that would confirm everything the Academy had taught him about the fragility of defectors, the inevitable homesickness, the crack in the foundation he could use to bring her back into the fold. She considered the question with the same unhurried precision she had once applied to infiltration protocols, stirring the pot, and said at last that she missed nothing, and that the admission frightened her more than anything Earth had shown her, because a mind that misses nothing of the place that built it is a mind that has finally been permitted to become something other than an instrument. "You'll ask Ro Thessaly the same question," she said, not looking up from the broth. "Ask him what he's painting instead." It's a better question. It has an answer that isn't a refusal. The third scout he found, a man designated Ro Thessaly, who had once been the Dominion's foremost expert in orbital infrastructure sabotage. He found painting. Not observing paintings, creating them, in a cramped studio apartment in Lisbon overlooking terracotta rooftops that caught the late afternoon light in shades of copper and rust. Canvases stacked 4 and 5 deep against every wall, each one an explosion of color that had no reference point in any Dominion aesthetic training, because Dominion aesthetics did not include the category of things made for no purpose except the pure, unjustifiable pleasure of making them. Rothessally's hands when the Admiral found him were stained blue and ochre to the second knuckle, and he did not stop painting when Vantric Saul entered, only glanced over his shoulder and said, "In Ashari gone soft and strange with disuse, you're the fourth one they've sent to find us. Did you know that? The others don't come back to report any more either. I wonder if the Primarch has noticed the pattern yet, or if he's still telling himself each defection is an isolated incident." Vantric Saul had not known that. It struck him, standing in that paint-cluttered studio with its unfamiliar amber light, that he had assumed without ever examining the assumption that he was different from the officers who had come before him, Fleet Commander Thren, whoever else had been quietly dispatched and quietly lost in the months between her request for relief and his own arrival. He had assumed his discipline would insulate him. He understood, in that moment, watching Rothessally's brush move across the canvas with an intimacy and hunger that had no analog in 211 years of his own carefully governed life. That this assumption had been the mistake every single one of his predecessors had made, right up until the moment it stopped being true for them too. "What are you painting?" he asked, and the question came out quieter than he intended. "I don't know yet," Rothesally said, and he was smiling, the same loose, unguarded smile Vay-11 had worn in the amber light of the club. "That's the entire point, Admiral. I don't know until it's finished. Nobody tells me what it has to be. I get to find out." He set down his brush at last and crossed the room to a stack of finished canvases lined against the far wall, drawing one out with the careful reverence of a man handling something alive. It was a portrait unmistakably human, an old woman's face rendered in cracked, weathered strokes of umbre. And white, her eyes lined with a depth of years the Dominion's smooth, ageless faces could never replicate, because the Dominion did not permit its citizens to age visibly past a certain calibrated point, considering the visible erosion of time and inefficiency to be corrected rather than a record to be kept. "She sells flowers 2 streets from here," Rothesally said. "I don't know her name. I've painted her 4 times because I can't stop trying to get the exact color of tired in her eyes, and every time I fail, and every time the failure teaches me something I didn't know about seeing. On the Dominion, Admiral, we would have called this a waste of 70 hours. Here, they call it devotion, and they don't think it needs justifying beyond that word." Vantric Saul left Lisbon 2 days later, and it was on the transport back to the occlusion, watching the ordinary sprawl of human light scatter beneath him in the dark. A species that had not yet mastered interstellar flight, arranging itself, city by unplanned city, into patterns of light no algorithm had designed and no central authority had governed, that he began, for the first time in 211 years, to lose sleep. His logs from this period, later recovered and studied exhaustively by Dominion analysts trying to understand what had happened to their most trusted officer, showed a man conducting an increasingly desperate rearguard action against his own neurology. He filled his reports with page after page of tactical analysis, threat classification, containment recommendations, a man building higher and higher walls of procedure around a mind he could feel, with mounting alarm, beginning to want things it had never wanted before. He wanted to hear the trumpet again. He caught himself twice, humming a fragment of Delenn Voss's Ramen Shop Radio, a pop song whose lyrics he did not understand and whose melody he could not stop replaying in the quiet hours of his solitary watch. And once standing before the occlusion's sole viewport at an hour when even the ship's automated systems had dimmed themselves toward rest, he caught his own reflection in the dark glass and did not, for one disorienting moment, recognize the expression on his own borrowed human face. Something loosened around the eyes, something that had not been there in 2 centuries of mirrors, something that made him look, for one unguarded second, less like an admiral of the Ashen Dominion and more like a man who had, without ever quite deciding to, begun to come home to himself. He requested, and then deleted the request, and then requested again, access to the Dominion's small classical music archive. 4 minutes of Beethoven's 7th Symphony that Fleet Commander Thren had, months earlier, attached to a directive meant to warn scouts away from exactly this kind of exposure. He listened to it 17 times in a single night, alone on the silent bridge of the occlusion, And on the 18th listen he found that his hands, without his conscious instruction, had begun to move very slightly in time with the rising strings of the second movement. And he sat very still after he noticed this, staring at his own traitorous fingers in the cold blue light of the bridge, and did not sleep again that night. Of the Admiral's increasingly erratic reports reached the Dominion homeworld within weeks, and it was here that the true scope of the catastrophe began to reveal itself, because Primarch Kel Asher, alarmed by the tone of Vantric Sol's transmissions, reports that had once been models of clinical precision now arriving laced with description, with detail, with observations about light and sound and taste that served no strategic purpose whatsoever, made his third and most catastrophic decision of all. He convened the full Dominion Council to review the accumulated evidence, intending to demonstrate, through overwhelming and irrefutable data, exactly what threat the human species posed and why immediate, total quarantine of the entire Sol system was the only rational response. He played them the recordings. It did not occur to him, not until it was far too late to undo, that a council of 11 trillion beings whose entire civilization had spent 9 centuries starving itself of feeling was, perhaps, the single most vulnerable audience in the galaxy for exactly the kind of exposure he was attempting to warn them against. He played Ve-11 trumpet in the Dominion's Grand Assembly chamber, intending it as evidence of contamination, and watched, with a horror that took him several full minutes to even correctly identify as horror, as 3 senior counselors, beings who had not shown a documented flicker of emotional variance in over a century of public service, sat utterly motionless through all 11 minutes, and then when the recording ended did not move, did not speak. For a silence that stretched on long enough that the chamber's automated systems flagged it as a potential medical emergency. He played Dylan Voss's film footage next, the father searching the vast unknowable ocean for his lost child, intending it as an example of the crude emotional manipulation the human species employed, and a junior aide near the back of the chamber, barely 2 decades into her career, made a sound the Primarch had never once heard in the whole of Ashari public life. A single, broken, involuntary sob, quickly and shamefully suppressed, but not quickly enough. Because 6 other members of the assembly turned toward the sound not with the disapproval protocol demanded, but with something that looked unmistakably like recognition. He tried twice to intervene to stop the playback, to remind the assembly that they were witnessing a threat and not a gift, that every reaction rippling now through 11 trillion carefully governed minds was itself the very contamination he had convened them to contain. His voice, when he attempted it, came out thinner than he had ever heard it in 400 years of rule, and it occurred to him, with a horror too large to fully process in the moment, that perhaps it was not the recordings alone doing this work but the simple, cumulative fact of a species finally being shown, after 9 centuries of silence, an image of itself as it might have been. He watched an elderly counselor named Ves Aloran, a man who had sat beside him through 6 major policy crises without once altering his expression, reach across the space between their seats and take the hand of the aide beside him, not a tactical gesture, not a calculated one, but the same unhurried, unrehearsed motion the human couple in the New Orleans club had made without ever having met each other before that night, and hold it silently through the remainder of the footage. As though some instinct 9 centuries old and never once permitted expression had simply reasserted itself the moment the opportunity arose, patient as stone, exactly as it had in Kel Asher's own admiral, exactly as it would within the hour in the Primarch himself. By the time he reached the images of Rothesely's paintings, brought up not as evidence of contamination, but the Primarch realized with dawning and total dread, as the thing that finally broke the room entirely, the chamber was no longer a council. It was a gathering of 11 trillion silver-skinned beings, each independently, privately, catastrophically discovering the exact same unbearable truth that had already claimed 17 of the Dominion's finest operatives, and was, at that very moment, closing its hand around the mind of the admiral he had sent to stop it. that they had not eliminated emotion from their civilization at all. They had only ever suppressed it, buried it alive beneath 9 centuries of engineered silence, and it had been down there the entire time, waiting, patient as stone, for the first crack of light. The Primarch adjourned the session in the only way he still had authority to do, by simply stopping mid-sentence, because he had looked out across the assembly and realized that half the chamber was weeping, openly, without shame, for the first time in living Ashari memory, and he did not have a protocol for what came next, because no protocol had ever imagined it would be necessary. Word spread through the Dominion in a way that no formal communication ever could have achieved, because it was not spread through official channels at all. It moved the way water moves through cracked stone, through informal networks, through officers who had watched the assembly footage and could not stop thinking about it, through analysts who had transcribed hours of human music for classification purposes and found themselves, late at night, replaying it not for analysis, but because some new and unfamiliar hunger in them wanted to hear it again. Within a single Dominion month, quiet defections began appearing across a dozen administrative sectors, nothing so dramatic as the scouts vanishing into human cities, not yet but small fractures. A logistics officer who requested, for the first time in her career, personal leave with no stated purpose. A counselor who was found, late one night, standing alone in an observation dome, listening to a recording of VE-11 trumpet on a personal device, tears running freely down a face that had not produced them in 80 years. The Primarch, watching the reports accumulate on his desk with mounting and specific horror, understood at last what his own cultural division had tried, weeks earlier, to warn him of in careful clinical language he had not fully absorbed until now. This was not an invasion. Humanity had not sent a single soldier, fired a single weapon, or issued a single demand. They did not even know, most of them, that the Dominion existed. They had simply continued doing what they had always done, making music because a feeling demanded release, painting because a color would not leave them, alone until it was on a canvas, cooking because hunger and love were, in the human species, apparently the very same impulse wearing 2 different faces. And in doing so, entirely without intent, they had built a civilization so saturated with unguarded feeling that mere exposure to its residue was enough to unmake 900 years of careful Ashari engineering. Admiral Vantrick Saul's final report from Earth, transmitted 6 months after his arrival and composed, according to the ship's own internal logs, over the course of 11 consecutive sleepless hours, was not addressed to the War Council. It was addressed to the Primarch directly, and it began not with a tactical assessment but with a description, 3 full paragraphs, entirely uncharacteristic of the man who had once commanded the Asheran campaign without his voice ever changing register, describing the taste of a dish called arrabbiata that a scout named Fen Cassio, the 17th and final defector, had cooked for him in a small kitchen in Naples 2 nights earlier. He described the specific burn of the chili at the back of his throat, a sensation his biology had never been designed to register as anything but damage, and the way that sensation had, against every principle of Ashari physiology, resolved itself not into pain but into something the human across the table had called laughing, the good kind of suffering, and how Vantrick Saul had sat with that phrase for the better part of an hour afterward, turning it over and over. Because it had cracked open something in his understanding of his own species that he did not know how to close back up. He described the arrabbiata itself in a level of sensory detail that no Ashari military report had ever contained in the history of the Dominion. The specific resistance of the pasta against his teeth, cooked, Fen Cassio had explained with the pride of a man reciting scripture, to a precise firmness the humans called al dente, a texture that existed for no functional reason except that its absence would have been a small, deliberate tragedy. The brightness of the tomato cutting against the low, patient heat of the chili, built slowly over a base of garlic bloomed gold in olive oil until the whole kitchen smelled. He wrote, like something he could only describe as welcome. The way Cassio had refused to let him eat in silence, insisting instead on a bottle of rough local red wine and a story about the dish's origins in a poor Roman neighborhood. Its name literally meaning angry, because the sauce was meant to make the eater's lips burn with a heat that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with being, however briefly, entirely present in one's own mouth, one's own body, one's own single unrepeatable evening. Vantric Saul had eaten 3 helpings. He confessed in the report, wanted a fourth, and had not taken it only because some last surviving fragment of Dominion restraint had told him that wanting a fourth helping of anything was itself a data point too dangerous to generate. He described in the same report standing before a human artwork for the first time, not a reproduction, not a scan, but the object itself, in a small gallery in a city whose name he no longer bothered to disguise in his own private logs. A canvas of swirling blue and gold, thick ridges of paint rising from the surface in a way that caught the gallery light and seemed, impossibly, to move. He had stood before it for 40 minutes, he wrote, and he did not have language, Ashari language, the only language his mind had ever truly been built to think in, for what had happened in that 40 minutes, except that he had understood, standing there, that the painter who made this work had died in poverty and obscurity, unrecognized in his own lifetime, and had kept painting anyway, compelled by something no calculation could justify. Something the Dominion had spent 9 centuries teaching its citizens to regard as the mark of an inefficient, undisciplined mind. And Vantric Saul had stood in that gallery and understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than any battlefield ever had, that the painter had been right, and the Dominion had been wrong, and that every one of the 11 trillion Ashari citizens currently living lives of perfect, governed, emotionless certainty was the poorer for it, was diminished, was the word arrived in his mind fully formed in Ashari, a word so old it had nearly fallen out of use entirely, starving. The final paragraph of the report was the one Primarch Kel Asher would return to alone for the rest of his long life, turning it over the way Vantric Saul had turned over the phrase the good kind of suffering, unable to close it back up. Recommend immediate and total recall of all remaining Dominion assets from the Sol system, the Admiral had written, and then beneath it in a hand that the ship's logs confirmed had trembled very slightly as he wrote it. I do not belie. V recall will be effective. I do not believe I am capable of complying with it myself. Sir, I have seen what this species does without ever meaning to do it, without armies, without weapons, without a single act of aggression, and I am asking you, as the last order I expect to ever follow, to seal this system, quarantine every record, erase every recording, and never let another Ashari citizen within 100 light-years of what I have found here. Do not send anyone else to retrieve me. There will be nothing left of them to retrieve. The Occlusion's last confirmed transmission arrived 4 days later, and it contained no data, no report, no coordinates. It contained 11 minutes of audio, the same trumpet recording that had started everything replayed once more, this time by the ship's own systems, on a loop that ran for the entire duration of the transmission window, as though the Admiral had simply wanted one final time to make sure it reached home exactly as it had first arrived. Not as evidence, not as a warning, but as an offering. Primarch Kel Asher did seal the system. He issued the total quarantine his admiral had begged him for, buried every record of the mission in the Dominion's deepest archive, and forbade, under penalty reserved for only the gravest crimes against Dominion's security, any further contact with the third planet of that unremarkable yellow star. It was by every metric the Ashari still possessed for measuring such things, the correct decision, the only decision consistent with 900 years of careful civilizational engineering, the only decision that might yet contain the fracture before it swallowed the whole of Dominion space the way it had swallowed 17 scouts, a fleet commander's composure, and finally an admiral who had never once in 2 centuries of service failed at anything he was asked to do. But sealing the system did not undo what the assembly chamber had already witnessed, could not erase what 11 trillion citizens had already begun, quietly and privately, to feel stirring in the space the Dominion had spent 9 centuries trying to empty. Word kept moving through cracked stone. Recordings, copied before the quarantine order reached every archive, kept circulating in the dark. And somewhere in the vast silver towers of the Dominion capital, in the private chambers where a Primarch who had ruled for 400 years without ever raising his voice now sat alone at night, unable to sleep, there hung a single image he had confiscated from the sealed files rather than destroyed, telling himself it was for study, for understanding the threat, for purely tactical reasons. A photograph of swirling blue and gold, thick ridges of paint catching light that did not exist in this room. On this world, in this entire ordered and silent and perfectly governed empire. He had banished humanity from Dominion memory. He had sealed the system, erased the mission, forbidden every citizen under his rule from ever again coming within 100 light-years of that small blue world and its impossible, ungoverned, unbearable capacity to feel. He told himself, each night that he stood before that stolen image and felt something old and buried and 9 centuries starved stir awake in his own carefully engineered heart, that banishment had been enough. That distance alone would hold the line where discipline had failed 17 of his best, and finally his most trusted officer besides. He was wrong, and some quiet, unguarded part of him, a part he no longer had the will to fully silence, had already begun to understand that he was wrong. The way you understand a wound is mortal long before you understand you have already stopped fighting it. He should have burned the image. He should have ordered every recording destroyed down to the last byte, every witness silenced, every memory of that trumpet and that ocean-searching father and that thick, impossible blue erased from the mind of every being who had heard it. He had built an empire on the premise that feeling could be engineered away, contained, governed into non-existence. And standing there, alone, in a silence that no longer felt like peace, he finally let himself understand the truth his admiral had died, or worse than died, trying to warn him of. You cannot quarantine a species that was never trying to invade you in the first place. You cannot seal a system against a feeling that has already crossed the border and made its home behind your ribs. The Primarch had banished humanity. He had told himself, in the sealed silence of that decision, that banishment was mercy, that it spared his people the fate of the 17, spared the Dominion the slow unraveling that had already claimed a fleet commander's sleep and an admiral's last trembling report. But mercy had never been the operative question, not really, not since the first recording reached the homeworld and the first tear fell in a chamber that had gone 80 years without one. He had banished them. He had not destroyed the recordings, had not silenced every witness, had not found it in himself in the end to take the one action that might actually have worked. He should have killed them. Every scout, every recording, every last trace of that small, unbearable, radiant world. He had not been able to do it, and standing alone before a stolen painting of blue and gold that caught light which did not exist in his silver tower, the Primarch understood, with the same slow horror his admiral had felt in a Lisbon studio and a Tokyo kitchen and a New Orleans club, that he never would be able to. Some part of him, buried, starved, 9 centuries silent, did not want to. And in an empire built entirely on the premise that wanting could be engineered out of existence, that single quiet admission was already, quietly and irreversibly, the end of everything he had spent 400 years building. In the years that followed the quarantine, the Dominion did not collapse in any way the old war councils would have recognized as collapse. There was no invasion, no rebellion, no fleet of human ships descending on Ashari space with weapons blazing, because humanity, in all the long history of what came after, never learned the Dominion had existed at all. What happened instead was slower and stranger and far more total. Administrative sectors that had once processed 1,000 petitions a day without a single recorded delay began, quietly, to fall behind schedule, because the officers staffing them had taken to spending their sanctioned rest periods listening in private to recordings that should have been destroyed and somehow, through channels no investigation ever fully traced, never entirely were. A shipyard on the outer rim, tasked with completing the Dominion's newest generation of long-range cruisers, missed its production quota for the first time in 200 years. And when auditors arrived to investigate, they found, taped to the walls of the engineering bay, crude, untrained sketches. The shipyard's chief engineer, it turned out, had begun teaching himself to draw badly, hungrily. after a junior officer under his command had shown him without authorization. A single confiscated image of Rothessally's blue and gold canvas passed hand to hand through the sector the way contraband always eventually is, because contraband that answers a hunger 9 centuries old does not stay contained by any wall a bureaucracy knows how to build. Primarch Kel Asher received these reports the way a man receives news of a slow illness in someone he loves, not as a single crisis to be solved, but as an accumulation month after month of small confirmations that the thing he had sealed away could not in fact be sealed, because it had never lived in the system beyond the quarantine line. It had always lived here, in the space behind 11 trillion ribs waiting. He considered more than once in those long years ordering the destruction of every remaining fragment, the stolen painting on his own wall included, and each time he found some new justification for delay, a study still incomplete, a threat assessment still pending, reasons that sounded, even to his own ears, increasingly threadbare, increasingly like the excuses of a man who no longer entirely wanted to succeed at the task he had assigned himself. He thought often, in those years, of the Admiral's final report, of the trumpet looping for the full duration of a transmission window, as though it were the only language left that said what needed saying. He thought of Fleet Commander Thren, quietly relieved of duty and never heard from again through official channels, though a rumor persisted for decades in certain administrative circles that she had requested, and been granted, a discreet transfer to a listening post with no further contact requirements, where she was said to spend her long solitary watches with a single recording playing on a loop she had stopped bothering to hide. He thought most of all of the 9 centuries his people had spent perfecting the art of wanting nothing, and of how thin, in the end, that perfection had proven to be against a species that had never once tried to conquer anyone, that had simply gone on making its trumpets and its paintings and its impossible burning food, because some old, unkillable part of being alive had demanded it of them, all the way back before language, before writing. Before the very first ember was coaxed into the very first fire against the very first cold and dangerous night. The painting hung on his wall for the rest of his life. He never destroyed it. He never stopped looking at it. And on the night he died, alone, in a tower of perfect silver silence that had once been the exact shape of his own certainty and had slowly, over the intervening years, become something closer to a cage he had built with his own hands and no longer knew how to leave. Last thing Primarch Kel Asher felt, the first and only time in 4 centuries he allowed himself to feel it fully, without governance, without restraint, without a single calculation standing between himself and the sensation, was something the Ashari language had no word for anymore, until a small blue world he had never set foot on taught his entire dying species, one stolen recording at a time, how to remember it.